take it away.
That's great. I've got to figure out a way to share my screen. Right now it says host disabled. So I'll leave that to you and maybe just say, well, I'm super excited to join. I was on earlier this morning and then I've been racing around a few meetings this afternoon. And so I'm just getting back and you find me in my lovely Minecraft garden, which is gives me the sense of being in nature while giving me the feeling that I'm in a very structured and safe environment, you know, safe from all the chaos of the world outside. So that's where my background's coming from. And let me see if I can, here we go. Looks like sharing, we're ready to share. And sharing is caring. So let me see if I can give a care here. Okay, do you see one of my browser windows?
Yep, I see your slides. You can just go into maybe present mode if that works, because I see that, yeah, there we go.
Yeah,
awesome.
Before I click the play button, I wanted to make sure it was the right one. It's loading, still loading. So it's, you know, it's not a live demo, but it is a live presentation. So there are things that can go wrong. If you can't hear me or you know, I will try to keep an eye on the chat window and feel free to ping me. So to conclude things today, you know, I wanted to sort of take it back up to maybe 20 to 30,000 foot, which is something a lot of us haven't been at that altitude lately. Some of us never, but in my role, I often have to get on planes. At least I used to. And this is a shot I took as I was flying to the west coast, and you can see the Rockies in the background. And there's just sort of this like amazing infinite sea of clouds. So I thought it was appropriate. And I'm here to give you some thoughts on the importance of open source in helping support our ability to navigate an uncertain future. And if an uncertain future sounds familiar, well, I guess it's, you know, it may be for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is lately has been quite an uncertain time. So hopefully this will be more relevant than ever. So just to, here you get to see my pre-pandemic hair, which is about as out of control as the garden right now. And I used to study biology, but I'm a bit of a failed scientist. And so I went to the tech industry for, so I could feel like I could really control outcomes. And I've spent about 20 something years there. I'm the founder of CloudOps and I'm involved, I guess a relevant sort of factoid would be that I'm involved in the Linux Foundation as a community contributor under Linux Foundation networking. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, just to say CloudOps has been around quite a long time. We've worked with pretty much the whole gamut of cloud technologies. And we've been working with the hyperscalers since the inception of their cloud computing platforms. And we have a really nice, really awesome team, you know, at a really reasonable number where I can actually remember everybody's names and really enjoy the community that we have and the communities that we get to work in as a result of open source. And that's a really, really important part of who we are and why we do what we do, and obviously why we're getting together today. And a key theme is really that is one of cloud agnosticity. In other words, we really believe that figuring out the right solution, you know, for a customer depends so much on their needs that we really want to listen first and then propose the best fit from all the amazing the amazing buffet of solutions that are available. And so our mission statement is enabling our customers to own their destiny in the cloud. And what does that mean? Well, we'll get into that a little bit. Really what we found is that helping customers succeed in the cloud is not a static solution. There's, you know, the solution that is right tomorrow isn't necessarily the solution that's right a month from now, let alone 6 months from now. or in the present, global crisis. And so we really think of this as a solution. Solutions need to evolve over time, and that's what we're helping our customers solve for. And our recipe is a mixture of lean and agile methodologies, which I think a lot of you are big proponents of. The use of cloud platforms, obviously, we're a little biased there, I have to admit. And using open source tools and tool chains, and possibly most importantly, DevOps culture, which we'll also circle back on. So like any good talk, I should probably start with why. So what we're really fighting for at the end of the day is something that we believe is a right, and it's the right to try something, fail, like I did in science, survive to tell the tale, adapt. In my case, I found a different niche, and then finally, hopefully, if one iterates enough, you can find that great, whatever you're looking for, product market fit, and be good at evolving over time. And it's a very, we see it as a very evolutionary journey. And understanding that, it's a journey, sometimes it's hard to get from where you are now to where you want to go, because topology, or because physics, or because, market maturity. There's all kinds of reasons it can be difficult. One thing we see a lot in cloud computing is something called data gravity. That's once you start building stuff on a cloud, you start with very little data, but over time, data has this dynamic where it tends to accrete more data. And then as there's more data in one location, it starts to pull the applications, the tools, and ultimately the users actually all want to be in close proximity. And that's, at the end of the day, that's because networks are, the speed of light is a constant. But it's a very important dynamic in the world of cloud computing. And what we're really trying to avoid at the end of the day is falling into the trap of thinking we need to have just one way of doing things. And I think that's a very, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, imperialist mentality, so that there's one way to do things. I think we really embrace, diversity, and we see that as a strength. And I think that's a very kind of Canadian thing to say these days. I think, so at the end of the day, we're really talking about freedom. And I think it's really important to highlight that our freedom to innovate, so to build product or to build our own projects or whatever it is we're trying to achieve, really is proportionate to some extent to our freedom to operate. So you can't evolve if you don't have latitude to move and to try things and again make mistakes and hopefully survive. Hold on a second. Sorry, I got a little latency here. Speaking of networks. There we go. So in the old days, technology actually used to be pretty straightforward. And that's when I started in the industry. Changes didn't happen that frequently. We generally felt that there was a best, sort of an ideal architecture, a best state, a best practice. And that we really felt that if we just get the design right, everything else will follow. And I think we've been racing into a world where actually things have become super complex. Outcomes are non-linear. So you might be scaling nicely for a while, and then all of a sudden you might stop scaling, and you could throw more resources at it, but it might not help. And that's a non-linear type of dynamic. The demand for change turns out is actually constant now, and I have to admit I've never felt it more relentlessly than I have in these last 3 months. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Referred to, there's no best state per se, although I think a lot of us would like to believe there is, and maybe in some cases there is. And then finally, this sort of notion that, if architecture used to define outcomes, well, in a modern sort of digital world, it's the operations that defines the outcomes. And that, again, that the learning that we get from operations is ultimately what drives into our lessons learned. And that helps us, build a culture based on experience. And obviously, Now we're working from anywhere, whereas in the past, apparently we used to work in things called offices. I don't know if anyone remembers them. But when we did go into the office and work together, you know, this is something we developed. Our logo was really to try to capture the idea that you have to start somewhere, but the idea is to really get to this virtuous loop, this virtuous feedback cycle. And I wanted to share a book that I read last year, and then I reread in this pandemic because I just thought it was just so awesome. It's called The Infinite Game. And it's really similarly about kind of loops and iteration, and the idea that in life, there's a lot of games that are finite where you know what the rules are and you know what's required to win. I mean, a game of hockey, for example, back when people actually used to be able to play hockey, right? There's a limited amount of time, you know what the rules are, you know, whoever scores the most goals wins. I mean, that's a finite game. And I think one of the interesting things about running a business, or even, let's say, building a product that is being delivered as a service, is that we start to realize very quickly that we're part of an infinite continuum in terms of timeline, and that we have to keep iterating, we have to keep improving. One of the things I really love about this book is it highlights a couple of key ingredients to be successful at doing really well in infinite games. One is a sense of purpose. Let's start with why. Having teams that work together with trust, identifying people you respect that you want to be, who inspire you, which is called worthy rivals, having courage to have leadership and be willing to take risks and possibly fail, super important. The fifth one I think is super relevant these days, and the author calls this existential flexibility. And it's, what do you do when things are changing around you and the things that you used to do are no longer necessarily that relevant? And that's really the chapter, let's say, that I'm focusing on these days. But I really love this book. I highly recommend it. And if the concept of infinity sounds familiar, looks familiar, well, you may have even seen it today. It's really what is behind this sort of virtual loop of DevOps, and an incredible ecosystem that has grown around it, and continues to grow. And a lot of those ecosystem members have been participating today, and it was great to hear from so many of them. Which brings me to a very interesting, let's say, subset of the overall community, which is, you'll probably note that there's an enormous amount of open source involved in our ecosystem. And I think there's a reason why. So open source foundations have been proliferating. There's an incredible landscape of them. You know, back in the day, I used to probably only be able to name one of them, Apache Foundation, maybe 20 years ago or so. I wasn't that sort of up to speed with open source. I was just getting into it at the time, and now just there's an unbelievable diversity. But a lot of them roll up under this, and the reason why I share the open source initiative, I hope some folks have heard of this before, is the open source initiative has been sort of taking the leadership around helping define you know, what are the characteristics of open source, and how do all these foundations kind of align themselves with the ultimate promise and mission of open source. And you'll notice that one of the key promises is like, it's a set of promises around quality, reliability, flexibility, cost, and avoiding lock-in. And that's a big, that, you know, I think that's a key element of why open source has been so important for us and our customers and our communities, is really it is providing us a lot of freedom to operate, you know, no matter what's happening in the market around us. So another way of thinking of open source is that you know, we are in such a fast-moving industry, we don't really have time to wait for, I don't know, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards for Technology, to come up with standards before we start building something. So my feeling is that in the cloud world, open source have become, in a sense, the new standards. And the OSI is kind of a standards body, kind of umbrella over kind of all these emerging standards. And, you know, I think this resonates with a lot of folks. This is a common analogy, is that is that within the open source community, we're creating the Lego blocks that allow us to build structures and to build thriving metropolises that can stand the test of time and that can outlast any of the given blocks and can outlast, in fact, any of the players in the market. So these underlying blocks can be composed themselves into larger tools and tool sets. And again, we've heard from many of those today. And that then allows us to go and build products that are highly opinionated to serve a particular product market fit and package them appropriately. And obviously there's an enormous diversity of products. And I'd say, they're coming faster and more furious than ever. And then where I think it gets really interesting, and I missed a slide here. Oh yeah. So I wanted to capture the metropolis thing again. I mean, I think where it gets really interesting is a thriving metropolis is really a very, it's something that emerges out of underlying complexity. And it's composed of all these building blocks, and some of them are open source and some of them are not. And there's a lot of different actors, and if you're living in a democracy, you have enormous freedom to operate. And I think that's at the end of the day, the happy, healthy sort of metropolis is what many of us are looking to be a part of, and looking for what is our niche and how do we serve that within that community. Speaking of communities, cloud native community is a really key one. That's what we're here today to celebrate, discuss, and build upon. And it's worth noting that we're into just over 6 years since the first commit of this little teeny tiny project called Kubernetes that we were very lucky to get involved in extremely early on. And that has become just a huge phenomenon. And almost like a bit like in, I don't know if any of you do gaming, but there's a game called Civilizations, which I think is an absolutely awesome game. And there's something in there called a technology tree. And every once in a while, you discover a technology, you build a technology that actually unlocks a whole tree, and I think that's a very, again, evolutionary biology concept. But the notion that Kubernetes actually unlocked an incredible sort of technology tree, I think is somewhat represented in this diagram. And this is the cloud native landscape, which is growing day by day, and which I think many of the logos you have heard from today are somewhere in this eye chart, which I can't really read because I was informed very recently that I need reading glasses, but it's kind of difficult to pick up reading glasses these days. So I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it at that. But that sort of level of diversity again sort of reminds me again of biology. And there's something in biological evolution called the Cambrian explosion, which is where really the majority of the body plans, the designs of organisms actually emerged in a very short amount of time. And I think that that's something which is open source right now has the combination of the governance and the practices of open source and the communities of open source have led to this incredible era of creativity, which is just amazing to be part of. And so just to tie back to the infinite game, I mean, we really believe open source is the key strategic pillar that sort of unlocks and supports an infinite game, allowing us to really build, to build and innovate in ways that can stand the test of time. And just to maybe make a note, since I'm from the cloud computing world, that many of us forget, is that the modern hyperscale clouds literally could not exist without open source software. There is no way these companies can build and operate at the scale that they do without being supported by open source. And in fact, Amazon Web Services, which is one of the first, possibly the first cloud computing platform, was really built out of open source Lego blocks. So I think that's a really important thing to remember. But that said, like I'm a technologist. I love technology, and that's where, it's like my happy place, it's like my Minecraft garden. But really, one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that this infinite game actually really doesn't just come down to open source, because behind open source is actually people, open source wouldn't happen without people. And so I think this is a lesson that I think took me a few decades to, and I feel like I'm continuing to learn about it. But one of the things I wanted to do is just, thank all of you for participating, for being part of this, for getting together online, even though it's not super easy, and taking the time to ask questions and or develop or present to share your thoughts and create a presentation. That is ultimately how all of this moves forward, is really by all of us, and it's by the people. So without the people, there's no infinite game. Which leads me to my blank slide, because I can't really talk about people and community without recognizing, I've already recognized, obviously, we're in the midst of a rather, complex and uncertain time, really thanks to our biology in a sense, right? So if you look at the pandemic, it's a very biological cause that's behind it, but obviously has a very widespread impact because, we all share our biology. And I think that's something which has been thrown into sharp relief in the last 3 weeks or so, with and is being recognized globally with protests where people are standing up for really fundamental rights that are not very far removed from the rights and freedoms we were just talking about, that are so important in being able to build technology and to participate in open source. And so I wanted to take a moment to recognize that, to appreciate that, and to let us all think about that, because I think our industry, the technology industry, has not historically been necessarily one of the most diverse or even accepting communities. And I think my feeling is we have come a distance, but that there is an enormous amount of work to be done yet for everyone to feel like a first-class citizen. And we really have to understand that anyone working in the technology industry today is in a position of privilege compared with many communities in the world. So I don't want to belabor it. I know that lots of folks are talking about it, and we are listening deeply right now to what's happening, and trying to understand how we can evolve from here. And I think that is ultimately, if we want to support our mission, which is a mission of, I think, freedom and openness, and supporting the right to operate, the right to innovate, we can probably do very well to focus on the people, our communities, and how can we be more inclusive, and how can we really build upon a lot of hard work that has been done to date, and build on it in a way where there's really the ability for full participation in the process of building technology and solving problems, which is, I think, something near and dear to many of our hearts. So on that note, how to get involved? Well, the easy one from my perspective, there's so many different ways. One of the most obvious ways is there are some great open source communities. One that Julie has been an amazing leader within is the Kubernetes communities and cloud native communities in Eastern Canada. Very easy to get involved. Everything's on meetup.com, and obviously there's all kinds of sort of subgroups. If you're interested in a very particular aspect of cloud native, there's lots of opportunity to get involved in networking groups, in all kinds of amazing projects, as that diversity has really exploded, as we were looking at earlier. And that's And I think that's good news for everyone. So I wanted to leave you on that note, and just with that message that, you know, we have, you know, I think a mission that we very much believe in at CloudOps, and we hope you do too. And we're just happy to be in the community with you, going shoulder to shoulder and evolving.